All right. Hi, everyone. Happy Blurs Day, because all the days are blurring together. This is our second video going through church history. Basically, the stuff that comes up after the events you can read about in the Bible. And so last week, I talked about the persecution of the church starting from the Roman Empire. So originally, in what you're reading about in the Bible, is persecution of Christians coming from the Jews. And then there were some things that happened that caused the Jews to kick Christians out of the synagogues. Christians lost that official sort of tie to Judaism, which had been protecting them. And without that protection, the Roman persecution started. So we talked about that last time. And one of the things that I mentioned last time was that you could, if you were accused of being a Christian, and at this point we're in the 2nd century, so we're in the 100s. If you were accused of being a Christian, in some places in the Roman Empire, they would interrogate you until you rejected your faith, and if you didn't reject your faith, they would kill you. And it was fine, and that was the agreed upon way to deal with Christians at the time. So that's not good. And because you had all you needed was someone to say, Bob's a Christian. Bob gets pulled in, and if Bob really is a Christian and he's not willing to reject his faith, he's going to get killed. That's pretty significant. I mean, it gets worse later on, but that's a really significant consequence. Just to being accused of being a Christian. Not saying that you did something in particular that was wrong, but just that you get accused of going by a particular name. That's really hard. And so what happens is, here's the idea. If you think that somebody is doing something really dangerous and bad, you're more likely to report them, right? So if you think your neighbor is a terrorist, you're very likely to report that person and to the authorities and say, here's what I think is going on. But if you think your neighbor is doing something else that's illegal but nobody cares about, you might just not say anything, right? You might just mind your own business. And so because just the accusation of being a Christian would get a legitimate Christian killed. There were a group of Christian thinkers who sort of rose up during the 2nd century. We call them apologists, and they took responsibility for defending Christianity, and that's what apologist means. It means a defender. So they took responsibility for defending Christianity against a lot of the misconceptions that were in the world about what Christians were doing and what they were up to, because people thought Christians are dangerous and they're bad. And so some people had to step up and say, Christians are not dangerous and bad. Let me explain. There were a few misconceptions, so let me share some of these misconceptions. Just these are things that people thought about Christians that made them very quick to accuse people of being Christian. Okay, number one, Christians had at the time, and this is true, Christians had a gathering every week that they called a love feast. Not what I would call it. They weren't calling it church or something like that. They were meeting together every week for a love feast, and it was only for people who had been baptized into the church. At the same time, Christians were calling each other brother and sister, even Christians who were married. So, a husband and a wife would be, at the market or something, and you knew that they were married, and she would call him brother, but you knew, and they've got children together. And so you put those two things together, that every week Christians have a love feast. It's a private thing. It's a love feast. And they call each other brother and sister even if they're married and have children. So it looks like they're married to their brother or sister, and they have these weekly like sex parties or something like that. That really was the misconception in the Roman Empire about Christians was that they have a weekly incestuous sex party. So somebody had to clear that up. There was also the fact that Christians talk about eating the body of Jesus and drinking the blood of Jesus. That can be pretty scary. That can sound dangerous and bad. And then there was this rumor that Christians eat babies. I read at one point that the thought was Christians were putting babies into the communion bread and were eating babies like that, but that they eat babies. It was a real thing. I mean, it gets publicly addressed in multiple ways during the 2nd century that Christians are eating babies. I mean, it's not true, but that was the thought that was out in the world. There was another rumor that Christians worship a crucified donkey, and other things like that. And so there was a need for people to sort of rise up and say, here's what's really going on with Christians. Here's what we really believe, so that you're not so scared of us, so that you would stop reporting us so quickly for being Christian. So those were apologists. One of the other things that apologists were doing at the time was they were responding to intellectual concerns. So as Christianity was becoming a bigger deal, people who were, leaders in the Roman Empire, people, philosophers and people like that, were responding to the beliefs of Christians and were responding to the behaviors of Christians in sort of an intellectual way. And so some of these apologists started responding to those concerns. And so I wrote a little note to myself that at the time, Christianity was being accused of preying on women and children and being sort of a religion for the dumb, uncultured barbarians. And part of it was these misconceptions, but there was a Greek philosopher named Celsus, and he wrote and said that Christians prey on women and children because they wait for the head of the household to be gone, and then they show up and spread their beliefs and things like that. And the women and children believe the Christians, but the head of the household never would have believed. So they wait till the head of the household is gone before they show up and spread their lies. And so there was this sort of bad press that Christianity was getting in the empire. But here are some of some examples of the concerns that were being thrown against Christianity. One was that Christians were being accused of being atheist. Christians were being accused of being atheists. So, and it's almost funny, but here's why. Because in the Roman Empire, in the Roman culture, the Roman gods and the Greek gods, they all have statues. They all have idols. And the Romans were saying that because the Christian God doesn't have a thing, he's not, somewhere. He's not something that I can look at and say, that's the Christian God. Because you don't have a thing that I can look at, you don't have a God. So you're atheist. There was a big sort of push to call Christians atheists because you don't have a statue. And so that was, and actually let me read to you. There's Justin Martyr was one of the great apologists of the 2nd century. He wrote 2 apologies, and this is from his first apology, and this is to the emperor. I'm reading the first apology of Justin. This is chapter 9. The title is Folly of Idol Worship. And here's something he says, because Christians were being accused of being atheist, and so he's responding to that. And here's one of the things that he says about idols. He says, "And often out of vessels of dishonor, by merely changing the form and making an image the requisite shape, they make what they call a god, which we consider not only senseless, but to even be insulting to God, who, having ineffable glory and form, thus gets his name attached to things that are corruptible and require constant service." So what Justin is saying is that you take some material, like, okay, I'm grabbing things off my desk. You just take some material, like I've got a pad of paper. You take something and it's just it is what it is, and then you do stuff to it and you manipulate it and you turn it into you make it the right shape, and then you call it a god, and then you worship that thing. It's a pad of paper, you know what I mean? Or it's a ship, it's a broken vessel, and you just take the pieces of it and you move them around, and then you call it a god. And he says that's not only senseless, it's insulting to God, to our God, because our God is ineffable in glory and form. And to attach his name to something that we created, we can't do that. And so these are apologists who are, and we would call this a polemic. So he's actually defending Christianity and what we do. But part of that is also coming back against what the Romans do and saying, you're actually the ones that are doing something foolish here in just taking things and turning them into something else and then worshiping them. In fact, one of the criticisms was that the Roman gods that were made of precious metals had to be guarded, because otherwise thieves would come in and would break the nose off or the ear or the hand off and would sell the metal. And one of the early apologists said, how crazy is that your gods can't even defend themselves? They need guards at night. What kind of God is that? And so there is a degree of sort of coming, not just defending what we believe, but also coming back and saying, what we believe actually makes more sense than what you believe, and doing it like that. But that's, if apologetics is defense, the opposite, coming after what someone else believes, is called polemics. So anyway, words that you might not have heard before. So anyway, that was one of them, right? So Christians are being accused of being atheists just because we don't have a statue. Christians were not accused of, but Christians, because we believe that everyone will be raised up one day, that there's a final resurrection where Jesus raises everyone back to life and then separates his people, the righteous, from the unrighteous. Because we believe in a final resurrection, there was an intellectual sort of backlash against that is dumb, that how could you possibly think that? It's not even possible for all the pieces, and the bodies have rotted and things like that. The response from apologists was, if God can make everything out of nothing, he definitely can take things that he's already made and put them back together, even if they've been scattered. And so that was the response. There was this big concern that Christians are immoral, and I already mentioned that a little bit, that Christians were accused of eating babies and things like that. But the Christian response, the apologists came back and said, we don't even fight back when we're being beaten. We don't even fight back. We're so anti-bloodshed. How in the world could you believe that we would eat babies? That makes no sense at all. And so that was one response. And the other response, like I said, there was sort of the defense, and then there's also the polemic, right? So the other side of that was that the Romans in the 2nd century, it was fairly common for them to actually leave their babies exposed to the elements to die. And babies like that got picked up were often turned into prostitutes. And it's horrible to think about, but Christians would but Christians, as part of being Christian, if they saw that there was a baby who'd been left exposed to the elements, would actually adopt those babies, would take them home and care for them. But people who thought that Christians were eating babies would see Christians picking up babies off the street and taking them home, and it would perpetuate this idea in their minds that Christians were eating babies. So the apologists had to sort of respond to that by saying, of course we don't do things like that. that's crazy, and you can see that that's not the kind of people that we are and how we act in other ways. But also, if you want to talk about concern for children, you're the ones that leave those babies exposed to the elements. You're the ones that just leave them out there to die. We're the ones that save them. We don't eat them. We care for them. And so that's another one. And then the big one, and it's actually the concern that, because there were so many concerns that were coming up and apologists were responding to things left and right, the really, really big one that probably didn't get responded to as much as it should have, but I don't know if there was a better way to respond, but the big concern at the time was that Christians are subversive. Because Christians aren't worshiping our emperor and they aren't worshiping our gods, and they don't participate in the civic religious services that we do and the basic civic functions that we have related to our gods, and that is going to stir, that is going to not stir, it's going to sow seeds that are subversive to our whole way of life. And the apologist response to that was largely, yeah, we don't worship your gods, we don't worship the emperor, but we are some of the best civil servants that you have. And the emperor really doesn't need our worship. He really needs our prayer, and he needs our service. And we do those things. We pray for the emperor, we pray for his wisdom. And this is stuff that Justin Martyr wrote. We pray for him, but no, we don't worship him. But he doesn't need that anyway. And Justin goes back to something that Jesus said about the coin. He said, this is, Jesus took a coin and said, whose face is on the coin? We'll render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and unto God that which is God's. Caesar can have our taxes, he can have our service, he can have our prayer, but our worship is reserved for God. We don't worship him, but we're still, that's not hurting anybody. That's not hurting anybody. But they didn't like that. They didn't like that. That was that really had been left that was not a satisfactory answer to the Romans at the time. One thing to keep in mind is that at this time Christians are still trying to figure out how do we be salt and light in the world? In what way can we participate in the world, and in what ways should we not be participating in the world? Where is that line? How does Christ intersect with the culture, and how do we figure out where to go? What are things that we can support? What are things that we have to be against? What are things that we're neutral about, that are just left up to your convictions? How do we engage the gospel and engage in the world around us? And so Christians are trying to figure that out. And the particular issues that the apologists were defending and were addressing in their letters really helped early Christianity frame out how do we participate in the world around us? How do we understand the gospel's role in a not gospel world? And so it was incredibly important for the early church to have some of those thoughts coming out, and to be able to land on particular issues. For example, there were some things that all Christians, sort of as a result of this, all Christians pretty much agreed on. They agreed that we're not worshiping false gods. They agreed that we don't reject Jesus. We don't deny our faith. They all agreed that we are building on the Jewish heritage, that we are heirs of the Jewish religion, which was important to understand at the time. There were some issues that there were mostly agreement on, but not entirely. For example, joining the military. So most Christians believed that you should not join the military because the Roman military would require you to make sacrifices and make vows to their gods. And because we can't do that, therefore we shouldn't be joining the military. But there were still a lot of Christians who joined the military in Rome. So it wasn't something that everyone agreed about. But there was one issue in particular that did not find widespread agreement. There really became sort of a division in two sides to understanding how to deal with it, and that was how do we participate in or understand the value of classical literature and philosophy. And that might sound boring to you, but here's the issue, is that Greco-Roman philosophy, for example, was sort of the best the world had come up with at that point. It was very valuable, and so what do we do about that? Because the early church didn't have the Bible like this Bible. They didn't have the Bible and the New Testament all the way together like my Bible is, but they did have access to the letters. The letters that we have here were going around as letters, and were being copied and were being sent out and distributed. So they did have access to some of the ideas that we have here in the Bible, a lot of them. And there were some people who radically opposed the world's wisdom. Guys like Tertullian, who's one of the church fathers. Tertullian radically opposed. Basically, I don't want to play in their sandbox. I don't want to play in the Greco-Roman philosophical sandbox at all, because the world's wisdom is folly. The world's wisdom is foolishness. And there's a passage in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 19, that says that. And you're going, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I get it. The things that make the most sense to the world, God looks at and goes, man, you guys don't really know. You don't really know. So that makes sense. On the other hand, there were Christians who believed that we should try to take what the ancient philosophers had done, Greco-Roman philosophy had done, and try to redeem it, to try to take what's going on there and make it serve Jesus. And there's another passage, this is in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 15, that says that we should take every thought captive to obey Christ. And so you're looking at, what do we do about the world's knowledge? Well, I don't think we should. I think we should just throw it away and say, that's your stuff. We're going to stick with our stuff. And you go, I can see that. And then you've got other people saying, like, I think we need to jump in there and say, like Paul is at the Areopagus, and he says, well, you've got an altar to an unknown God. Let me tell you about the God that you don't know. And instead of just, never going there, going in there and then finding ways to make that honor Jesus, it's hard to say that either side is wrong, because they're both coming from a good place. Do you know what I mean? They're both coming from something that's good and God honoring, but because you've got two ways of approaching it, it creates this kind of division where some Christians, like Justin Martyr, start land over here and are caring about the culture more, about the culture's knowledge more, and then you've got guys like Tertullian over here who are saying, I don't even go there. I don't play in that box. We should stay over here. We should not go over there at all. And like I said, it's hard to say that either of them are wrong, but it did create this division, and you see, we'll talk about in the next video. We'll talk about how that early division about what to do and how to deal with the culture really led to more division. And when you look around our world today and you see that there are so many different denominations, different kinds of Christians, and then even within denominations there are people who argue about theology and stuff like that, and are you this kind of, are you this kind of? And there's a sort of foreshadowing of that in the Bible, where Paul says, where he's criticizing people who say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Peter. And he says, we should not be divided like that. But you do see some practical divisions about how do we play this out? You know what I mean? How do we deal with the culture? Do we do this or do we do this? Because I can kind of get both things. And so you see that division, and that division starts to expand more and creates pockets where things that are false can jump in and can say, well, hey, I've got an alternative for you, and can create more division within Christianity. So I think we'll talk about that next time. I think we'll also talk about how the apologist response to the criticism that Christianity is subversive because you don't worship our gods, how that particular criticism was much, much, much deeper than I think anyone really gave it credit for. And the response of, yes, we won't worship the emperor and we won't worship the Roman gods, but we're still going to pray for you guys, and we're still going to give our taxes, and we're still going to participate in all of the things that we can participate in. You will find that we are really good people in the empire. That really didn't sit well with the people in leadership who really believed that it is a primary basic part of being Roman to worship the emperor and to worship the Roman gods. And so you will find probably in the next video where I'll talk about the division of Christians more. We'll also talk about the increasing persecution against Christians, because what they found during this sort of apologetic surge was that Christians can really defend their faith. Christians can absolutely intellectually and on a practical level can really defend what they're doing and what they believe. These people are not just going to go away. They're not just going to go away. I mean, when we find them, we are interrogating them until they recant, or we're killing them. And they're not going away. In fact, they're jumping up and they're defending themselves. And there's a reason why Justin Martyr's last name is Martyr, because they killed him. They cut his head off in 165. And the apologist response was deeply concerning to the people who were in leadership in the Roman Empire, because it was robust. It was a robust defense, but also it didn't budge on, we're not going to worship your gods. And so we're going to see increased persecution and increased division. How does the church deal with that? I don't know. We'll find out. Thank you guys. I hope this is good for you. I hope you're being safe and hope you're well. If you have questions, please ask. I did have a couple things that came up this week that I'll try to address as they come up. But I'm grateful that you're watching, and I'm grateful for the chance to get to do something fun like this. So I hope you're enjoying. Hope this is enlightening to you, and I'll catch you next time. Okay.